everyone, it's Seiji, and before I get into this video, I'm really excited to announce that I teamed up with Amistad to give away 3 copies of Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick by Zora Neale Hurston. The giveaway is US only, but I decided myself to also give a copy away to someone who isn't in the US via bookdepository.com. I will leave a link to the post in the description box below, and also for an extra entry you can DM me the word Barracoon on Instagram. That is Barracoon. This book came out last month and contains 21 stories written by Zora during the Harlem Renaissance. 8 of them are actually lost stories that were recently found in forgotten periodicals and archives. I started reading this last month and it is an absolutely phenomenal body of work. It also contains an extensive introduction to Zora and her work, which was written by Genevieve West, who also edited this collection. And after reading that introduction, I was really intrigued by Zora, and I started looking up more of her work and looking more into her life, and thus that is how this video basically came about. And so without further ado, I present to you a portrait of the author Zora Neale Hurston.
Hello everyone, it's Seiji, and today I will be talking about the life and work of an author I recently started reading, namely Zora Neale Hurston. Zora is one of the most celebrated African American writers, blossoming during the Harlem Renaissance. She's most known for her novel Their Eyes Were Watching God, in which the main character, Jannie Mae Crawford, narrates her life to her best friend, Phoebe Watson. The novel explores Jannie's, quote, ripening from a vibrant but voiceless teenage girl into a woman with her finger on the trigger of her own destiny. Zora was the 5th child of a carpenter named John Hurston and a schoolteacher named Lucy Ann Hurston. All 4 of her grandparents had been born into slavery. She was born on January 7, 1891 in Notasulga, Alabama, and when she was 3, her family moved to Eatonville, Florida. This was a special town as it was one of the first self-governing all-black municipalities to be incorporated in the United States. These towns were often created as a necessity, seeing that local town and county police forces refused to protect black communities. Her father became mayor in the town in 1897 and in 1902 was called to serve as minister of its largest church. Eatonville had a huge impact on Zora's life, as she often referred to it as home. Sometimes she would even go as far to claim that it was her birthplace, and in a way you could say this was actually true. In 1901, when Zora was 10, some school teachers from the north visited Eatonville and gave Zora books that exposed her to literature. Later in life, she referred to this literary awakening as a sort of birth. After her mother's death in 1904, life quickly changed for Zora. Her father remarried the following year to a woman who Zora didn't like. This was actually quite scandalous because it seemed that her father was already involved with this woman before Zora's mother passed away. She spent the next few years working as a maid, and in 1917 she resumed her education. Apparently at that time, Maryland guaranteed a free high school education to anyone under the age of 20, and so Zora enrolled at the high school division of what is now known as Morgan State University. A year later, she began her studies at Howard University, a historically black college in Washington, D.C. In cities in the US, a literary renaissance was blooming. There in Washington, she found a black literary community that provided her with a network of support as she started publishing her fiction and poetry. By 1924, her work was accepted by what was at the time known as one of the leading magazines called Opportunity. Unable, however, to raise funds to complete her studies, Zora moved from Washington to New York, where her DC connections helped her publish several stories there as well. In 1925, 4 pieces of her work won awards, and Zora was able to connect with some people who eventually ended up facilitating her studies at Columbia University, where she graduated in 1928. It was in New York where Zora really came into her own as a writer. During the 20s, an African-American intellectual, social, and artistic explosion occurred, which at the time was known as the New Negro Movement, but which most will be more familiar with as the Harlem Renaissance. As the latter name suggests, this movement was centered in Harlem, in the New York borough of Manhattan. At its heart, there was a battle over images of African Americans. It advocated for art as a means of changing American culture and challenging its racism, and so artists were battling the racist stereotypes of African Americans that for so long had been used to dehumanize black people, which also helped sustain the argument for slavery and were now being used to repress both the political and economic economic progress of African Americans. One way of doing so was by trying to bring forward the image of the middle-class black person. Hurston, on the other side, aligned herself with people such as Langston Hughes and Rudolph Fisher and tried to explore the lives of the common people. What's interesting about Hurston's work, and one of the first things you'll notice when you read some of it, is that the text spoken by the characters in her stories are written phonetically. For example, this is a sentence in the first story of Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick called John Redding Goes to Sea. "Aw, woman, stop that talk 'bout conjure. 'Tain't so nohow. I don't want John to get that foolishness in him." This is something I felt to be really interesting because by writing down the words as her community would pronounce them, she gave her prose an oral quality. It also gave her people's way of speaking more merit, as most didn't regard it good enough to be put down as written word. Zora was very adamant on doing it this way. For instance, she was seeking a publisher for her book Barracoon, which she wrote after interviewing a man named Oluwale Kozola, also known as Kojo Lewis, who was one of the slaves who came on the last slave boat from Africa. At the time, Viking had offered to publish her work on the condition that she were to write it in so-called proper English. Zora refused, and eventually the book got published posthumously back in 2018, which is more than 90 years after it was written. Zora never backed down when it came to her use of idiom and kept fighting to reclaim the speech and tradition of black folks, as well as depicting the humanity of her characters. She used her prose to interrogate and debate on the stereotypes that the Harlem Renaissance was working on breaking down and that black people to this day still deal with. Zora was an extraordinary tough and brilliant woman who, under the circumstances, that is, living as a black woman during the Jim Crow era, managed to persist. When I was looking up information on Zora, I found this really interesting passage of hers on life that I wanted to share. Prayer seems to me a cry of weakness and an attempt to avoid, by trickery, the rules of the games as laid down. I do not choose to admit weakness. I accept the challenge of responsibility. Life as it is does not frighten me, since I have made my peace with the universe as I find it, and bow to its laws. The ever sleepless sea in its bed, crying out, "How long?" to time. Million-formed and never motionless flame. The contemplation of these two aspects alone affords me sufficient food for 10 spans of my expected lifetime. It seems to me that organized creeds are collections of words around a wish. I feel no need for such. However, I would not, by word or deed, attempt to deprive another of the consolation it affords. Somebody else may have my rapturous glance at the archangels. The springing of the yellow line of morning out of the misty deep of dawn is glory enough for me. I know that nothing is destructible. Things merely change forms. When the consciousness we know as life ceases, I know that I shall still be part and parcel of the world. I was a part before the sun rolled into shape and burst forth in the glory of change. I was, when the earth was hurled out from its fiery rim. I shall return with the earth to Father Sun, and still exist in substance when the sun has lost its fire and disintegrated into infinity to perhaps become a part of the whirling rubble of space. Why fear? The stuff of my being is matter, ever changing, ever moving, but never lost. So what need of denominations and creeds to deny myself the comfort of all my fellow men? The wide belt of the universe has no need for finger rings. I am one with the infinite and need no other assurance. Now let's go back to her short story collection, Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick. The title in particular, although not knowing what it exactly meant, really intrigued me. I liked it because it had a great ring to it. Hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick. It's a saying, and Tayari Jones states that it means to achieve a goal that seems to be in contradiction to the means by which it was accomplished. Zora described it as making a way out of no way, or winning the jackpot with no other stake than a laugh. In this collection, racism is present because unfortunately it is something that is almost inescapable in the lives of people of color. But in her stories, however, the struggle is not the epicenter of the characters' lives. Zora uses topics such as courtship and marriage to explore intersectionality, that is, not just viewing one aspect of a person's identity, but rather considering multiple facets such as class, race, and gender. When you look at a black woman from the upper class and a black man from the lower class, there are different dynamics that come into play. By taking different aspects into account, Zora manages to show how people live under different forms of oppression. In John Redding Goes to Sea, for instance, we see how the rift between the characters, the women on one side and the men on the other side, is due to their thoughts around masculinity. In the story Spunk, this topic is analysed through men having conflicting ideas of what it means to be manly. And Under the Bridge explores this topic as well, but adds the factor of age to it. Really, throughout the collection we get to see how Zora questions gender roles, identity, and explores different types of black experiences by cleverly shifting narratives and using strategies that, unbeknown to the publishing establishment, undermined the system that was currently in place. You could say she was hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick. Since these are short stories and span such a formative decade in Zora's life as an author, I think it's a great place to start if you're looking to get into her work. If you're someone who really enjoys non-fiction, then I would definitely recommend reading Barracoon. I actually listened to it when I was making this painting and it was really interesting. Going back to Zora and looking what became of her, it is in fact sadly true that she died in poverty and obscurity. Even her work slipped further and further into obscurity for decades for reasons both political and cultural. Given how racially charged the history of dialect fiction in American literature was, the next generations of writers felt that Hurston's use of dialect was demeaning. She also wasn't safe from criticism from her contemporaries. Several of them noted that it was a caricature of African American culture rooted in post-Civil War white racist tradition. Richard Wright reviewed Their Eyes Were Watching God and stated that the sensory sweep of her novel carries no theme, no message, no thought. In the main, her novel is not addressed to the Negro, but to a white audience whose chauvinistic taste she knows how to satisfy. She exploits that phase of Negro life which is, quote, quaint, the phase which evokes a piteous smile on the lips of the, quote, superior race. Eventually, it was Alice Walker, the author best known for writing the book The Color Purple, who after reading Their Eyes Were Watching God decided to take the trip to Florida to find out what happened to Hurston. There she found an unmarked grave and had a tombstone commissioned with the words, "A Genius of the South." Despite all these remarks, I still believe it's fair to say that Zora was both an extraordinary person and a very gifted writer, whose work has, despite its times of unpopularity, managed to persist and maintain a long-lasting impact on literature.
And that is the note I would like to end this video on. Here is the final painting. Either way, thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video.